Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that provides you an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world and ask how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's October 6th, 2025. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
I'm good. I'm feeling very dressed and pressed this morning, a little more formal than I usually am, because I just got off of a virtual class with Congressman Mike Quigley of Illinois, who I've known because he's been on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, who teaches a class at the University of Chicago on kind of the gamut of intelligence. And it gave me a chance to talk about the craft and discipline of intelligence that I love, especially in a moment where I think it needs to be radically different and it's still incredibly impactful. And then the second is, for all the people, all the boomers in my generation who love bemoaning the younger generation, holy smokes, the questions these students asked were so smart and so relevant that it's a great reason to stay involved in universities because you want to feel hopeful. How about you?
Not a lot going on. Wanted to ask you, what was your favorite Super Bowl halftime show of all time? And this is a question surrounding Bad Bunny being announced as the halftime show act for this year.
I'm going to say Bruno Mars. Holy smokes. Love his songs, love his energy. And maybe because he's of my kids' generation, I know his songs, but oh my gosh, so talented. But I'm down for Bad Bunny. One, I think it's a aggressive choice, but also he's just a great artist. I think it will be a great show. I'm a little worried about his concerns about whether the people who would want to see him might be targets of immigration operations. But I love the choice. How about you?
Bad Bunny, good Bunny, who gives a shit? Like, it doesn't matter to me. I'm not watching the Super Bowl for the Super Bowl halftime show. But people who are being drawn to it and the people who are paying millions of dollars for 30-second ads, they want to draw on that extra interest. And exactly like you said, he is one of the most popular artists in the world, very engaging music. And so I think it makes perfect sense.
So I agree. There's nothing about the halftime show that makes me watch. But if you're going to have a halftime show, make it entertaining.
All right, let's get to some headlines. So this week in the threat picture, SWIFT goes on chain. A bet tokenized value is further legitimized. Gangland geopolitics in Taiwan. Beijing's plausible deniability and how organized crime blurs espionage ahead of any Taiwan contingency. Netanyahu's quiet apology. After deadly strike in Doha, a rare mea culpa to Qatar, supervised in the White House. Shutdown shreds the small biz arsenal, while starving small suppliers puts primes at risk. And finally, Hegseth's hard line at Quantico. We'll discuss the lecture and what we took away from the War Department's 2025 vision. SWIFT is creating its own blockchain in order to facilitate transactions between global banks. In episode 11, our guest Shannon Corliss mentioned SWIFT when discussing digital currency. So who is SWIFT? A Belgium-based cooperative of over 11,500 institutions across more than 200 countries and territories. They're governed by the world's central banks, including the National Bank of Belgium, the U.S. Federal Reserve, and the European Central Bank, and they provide the global economy with secure and standardized financial messaging. The plan is to embed a blockchain-based shared ledger into its core infrastructure, designed for real-time 24/7 cross-border payments and enabling tokenized value transfers under smart contract rules. The initiative is explicitly intended to enable interoperability between legacy payment rails and emerging digital asset systems. Sue, what are your thoughts on SWIFT's announcement here?
I think it's furtherance of our agreements with Shannon. The digital currency and digital assets are just coming. This move had to happen. SWIFT is the gold standard for international banking. It has a lot of regulations, policies, standards, safeguards around it. So again, they're not going to be a casual employer. Okay, here's going to be a weird analogy. Much like when the CIA decided in 2013 that it was going to partner with relatively new Amazon Web Services to move to the cloud really early for the national security community and government writ large. What happened as a result of that was the intelligence community was an early adopter and could shape what it needed out of cloud services in terms of security. But Amazon got something out of it too by what it needed to be, took all its lessons on security and learned to apply them into their commercial technology. So I think one of the benefits of Swift making this move and announcement now is it's necessary. It's a trusted source. And as it applies the technology, it is liable to both drive new capabilities so it can maintain its reliability and also develop more modernity because it's taking advantage of the technology. So I think it's only good. It has all the other risks of this emergent digital asset environment, but given its standing, I actually think it's a good move and we'll learn a lot from it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it highlights a lot of the good things that Shannon pointed out to us. So continue watching it. Gangland, Geopolitics in Taiwan. A Washington Post investigation revealed that China is leveraging organized crime to extend its influence in Taiwan through the Chinese Unification Promotion Party, led by ex-gangster Chang An-lo, known as the White Wolf. The cup, tied to Taiwan's notorious Bamboo Union gang, has allegedly been involved in spreading pro-Beijing propaganda, recruiting spies, and intimidating critics under the guise of political activism. Taiwanese intelligence warns these groups could act as saboteurs or collaborators if China launches an invasion, and highlights Beijing's hybrid strategy, blending political warfare, criminal networks, and psychological influence to weaken Taiwan from within. Episode 3 of the Understandable Insights podcast, we discussed AI-enabled propaganda and influence operations, connecting state-led manipulation campaigns in China to national security risks. And the following week, in your romp around the world, you discussed some of China's multi-domain pressures on Taiwan and how President Xi Jinping's intent to reintegrate Taiwan, either peacefully or forcefully, was a warning that coercion through non-military means, like disinformation and influence ops, was escalating. So this shows off some of those gray zone conflict spectrum items we've talked about before, but how does Taiwan and its allies defend against that?
So I love this story too, and I feel pretty smug that we presaged it with very early episodes. One, it's not just a linkage between organized crime, espionage, and political coercion. It's actually a really good linkage between organized crime in general and cyber. A lot of cyber tools you first see in criminal activities just because it's so aggressive and going after new targets in its kind of ruthless pursuit of its needs. And so I would expect that we'd see some new capabilities coming out of this. Second, China is well known, as are many, like Russia, for using loose partnerships between the government and private sector entities to effect their cyber operations. You're right that it provides them some measure of deniability, and so I would expect them to continue to use it. I do note that in the proliferation and the fact that these are extra-governmental entities, there is also the risk to China of unintended consequence that they aren't aware of all the activities and some things they do might cross a line that then blows back on China. We saw that really early on with some of the ham-handed activities of early cyber actors in China who got discovered and then had the very public U.S. indictments against the Chinese government for the activities of a non-governmental organization. Just to be clear, though they use them, there is some risk to China, particularly when you're applying them against a geopolitical issue. But your question was none of those things. I just felt like showing off. One of the things that I think has always protected us against even cyber attacks against the U.S. is it is really hard to predict the coupling effects between cyber activity, and especially if you're going down the influence operations path. The fact that I suspect there is not perfect control within China's either MFA or PLA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or their military units, could lead to some problems. But the question you had about what does Taiwan do about this, knowing it's happening? One, it's been happening for a long time. Two, it's part of what I think is a boiling frog campaign, which is how many legal and or social barriers can China cross to try and put tacit pressure on Taiwan to convince the island or more the people that they should just be reunified without any sort of conflict. So I don't think this is a new activity. Interesting, Taiwan has a Ministry of Digital Affairs. Their first minister, Audrey Tang, I met. Really interesting organization in that the approach to it was not how we tend to do it of having a cybercom or a CISA, but actually the direct involvement of the people and expats who are globally distributed to be part of both an early warning and a defense mechanism. So when they see these influence campaigns or the attempts to shape public opinion or to set up things that are going to be threatening, at least under Audrey, what the Ministry of Digital Affairs did was a very aggressive, very publicly involved, proactive defense against influence operations. And you saw a bit of that Ukraine was very effective. If you remember at the very start of the Ukraine war, we were really worried about Russian cyber operations in Ukraine, and they were very effective at defeating them. So I think it always is difficult for open societies to not be susceptible to concerted, targeted, and again, China certainly knows a lot about culturally how to appeal to the people. But I do think the fact that they have some experience and they have a focused ministry gives them some opportunity for a different kind of protection. They should be, whether they affect that in the same way they envisioned it, positioned, and whether they have all the elements of their cyber defenses linked together, I think remains to be seen. But I think they have an approach that involves the people that should give them some benefit in this kind of attack.
Yeah, almost sounds like a cyber militia of sorts, employing the people, and they have a stake in it. Many of the things we've talked about here in terms of cyber infrastructure. I wonder if there's a good blueprint there.
And they did, at least early on, have some notable successes in terms of basically pre-warning the population about messages that would come. And remember, back to use my Ukraine example, the U.S. government did a version of this when we preemptively said that Russia was likely to claim that the U.S. had biological warfare facilities in Ukraine. And because we put that information out when it was used by Russia, it was less successful to have an impact. It's not a bad strategy.
Here's a different strategy: Bibi's quiet apology. So a lot is developing in the peace deals in Gaza, but we wanted to talk specifically about the Axios report. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu personally apologized to Qatari Prime Minister Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani for an airstrike in Doha that killed a Qatari security official and violated Qatar's sovereignty. The apology, made during a meeting at the White House with President Trump, was a precondition for Qatar to resume mediation efforts between Israel and Hamas toward a potential deal to end the Gaza war and release hostages. Again, in episode 3, that's a pretty popular one here, we discussed diplomatic signaling and the limits of U.S. leverage, emphasizing that alliances required consistent credibility. What do you think about this apology, Sue?
On one level, I'm going to say any port in a storm. I think there is great need for an international interest in resolving what's going on between Israel and Gaza, which goes through a deal with Hamas. And so if all it takes is a quiet apology from the Oval Office, which signals U.S. backing for that approach, right? It's good to have friends. And we can talk about whether the U.S. is as revered internationally as it once is, but it is powerful internationally. So I think doing it from the Oval Office, having Netanyahu offer it isn't a bad strategy if that allowed the next step, which is the proposal of a peace deal for which Qatar would be supportive and get the Middle East back on track. I will say that we've been here before, that any ultimate agreement has to be between Israel and Hamas. Directly, we can help with security guarantees and bring people to the table, but ultimately it comes down to Hamas. And even though Hamas has tacitly agreed to the condition of returning hostages for any student of the Middle East, what Hamas's response was really a yes, but. Glad that it brought them to the table, glad that there's something on the table over which to negotiate because it's important, but a lot of work still to be done. And ultimately, it's between Israel and Hamas whether they can come to an agreement, and just watch the butts of the conditions, whether they will ultimately be agreed to by Israel.
I mean, I think if it was more sincere, it would have happened immediately afterwards.
Yeah, but, I guess I'm watching ourselves right now, and I'm thinking about the budget, the governmental shutdown. And if our president would say, you know what, I think this healthcare thing is really important, come on back to the table. Whether it was sincerely offered or not, I think it would be an incredible move. So I'm not sure that while you and I care a lot about sincerity, sometimes there's just signaling, and you got to take what you can get.
That's a good point. Well, speaking of government shutdown,
I did slide into that.
I appreciate that. So, small defense tech firms and entrepreneurial groups are particularly impacted by the government shutdown, warning Congress that it is severely damaging the U.S. defense industrial base. They cite past shutdowns that slowed defense procurement, cut contracts to small vendors by roughly 1/3, and weakened innovation capacity. Not just for newer, small margin firms, they even cite the F-35 program, one of the government's major acquisitions, came close to halting production during the 2013 shutdown. Small firms often do the high-end niche work that's harder to replicate at scale, creating a critical path that flows downstream to prime vendors like Lockheed Martin, maker of the F-35. So what are your thoughts on this decision and how it impacts smaller firms and then the downstream military-industrial complex impacts?
I love this article that led to us discussing this. I think it's one of the unseen consequences. And remember, it's not just this shutdown. We've been living under a continuing resolution that hasn't allowed new starts to happen, and DOGE that has really forestalled decision making as a new administration gets its feet under it with what their theory of the case and what their organizational structure has been. So governmental indecision is hugely impactful on the providers of products and services that allow those things to happen. Now, big contractors that have lots of money and have ongoing contracts can continue that work. And so, though it still affects them, and even the suppliers will be affected, and so programs will slow down, they won't deliver on time, they won't be able to make changes and modifications that they need. And in a weird sort of way, it's one of the reasons why the government is so slow to embrace newer companies with new ideas, because you just can't afford for something to happen for that company not to be fiscally solvent. So it's bad in general. Anything that disrupts U.S. government decision making for any period of time has a downstream effect that will affect generations subsequently. And you don't think about it, but it's almost like a 1-to-4 impact. For every 1 unit of time you don't make a decision, you usually get about 4 units of time delay in outcome, the Sue Gordon equation. The small companies, though, remember, these are a lot of companies that have bootstrapped, who spun up on the expectation and the signaling from the U.S. government that things are going to happen. They're relying on private investment and private investors who want to get their return. They hired staff. They know they have something that meets a requirement, but they can't get a decision out of it, or you can't get a new start, and your study money is running out, and that agreement you had that gave you $1.380 to prove a technology, isn't enough because now you're ready to scale and you've taken investment dollars to be able to do that, and now that doesn't manifest, a lot of these companies won't survive if this goes on for a long time. Even if you don't shut down the government and we go into another long-term CR, it doesn't solve the problem. And remember, this is all happening at a moment that we most need to change how we deliver our offensive capabilities and our defensive capabilities. So a really myopic view of things that impede government decision-making on a reasonable schedule so companies can do the planning they need to do to be able to deliver within the time frame the capability is needed. This is actually the second most myopic part of any budget, government shutdown, budget holdup, and government indecision, and that is when you decide to stop hiring federal employees. Man, hiring freezes are really bad in terms of being able to ensure that you will have continuous access to best talent. These are all decisions that will affect us, and you won't see it right away, but they will have an impact at exactly the moment we need to be able to hire the best talent and deliver the best capability into use into a disrupted world.
Yep, absolutely. It's the second and third order effects that you've talked about so many times before, and it inadvertently de-incentivizes these companies to get into government contracts, right? Because they don't have the runway. They're private investors. The longer it goes, the less return they have. And also their staff. Why does their staff want to stick around? A lot of them are being paid with equity. And if that doesn't materialize, they want to go somewhere else because they've got limited runway as well.
Yeah, perfect. Two things are true. One, talent follows quest. And so talent will go where the money is, and money is where the need is. And so you're breaking up that cycle. And your point about decision-making by that company is really affected. And so I think what you're seeing now is a moment with more companies that can't make a move if they thought they were going just into the defense space. They're going to have to see if they can be dual purpose. Man, and that's a hard road too. And the other one is you're going to see pursuing more international customers just because they're buying.
Yep. And there's more consistency there. And I don't think it's a lack of transparency so much as it's just really confusing to know what's funded and what's not funded. And a lot of this was evolving. I spoke with some people in the government the day before the shutdown, and they didn't know whether they're going to be furloughed or not, which is atrocious to me, how you don't have that plan and you haven't been able to communicate that to your people. But bring a little bit of levity here. Let's play a little game called What's Funded? So I'm going to name an organization or a project, Sue, and you tell me whether you think it is funded or not funded in this government shutdown. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
The national parks.
For right now, funded.
So not funded.
Huh.
Park roads, lookouts, trails, and open-air memorials will generally remain open to visitors, but a lot of the staff items are going to be closed. Park websites and social media are not going to maintain, so you don't really know what is additionally closing or what is additionally open, so that makes it a little trickier. But many other historical sites, so for example, like mission sites, they're open because they're privately funded.
Yeah, I can see how you get there. That is not entirely inconsistent with past shutdowns, except the parks have actually been closed right away.
All right, next one. The White House Ballroom Project. Funded or not funded?
Oh, totally funded.
Yeah, a bit of a trick. It is funded, and that's because it's privately funded by both President Trump himself and private donations. So no federal money, so that project continues going.
No federal oversight, no federal staff overseeing the projects, no federal employees doing it. All those people, I'm sure, are still doing their jobs.
The last one I got for you is NASA. What do you think NASA's doing in the shutdown?
I think this administration's made it clear that their views is not essential. So my guess is, with the exception of people necessary to operate the on-orbit assets, you have almost no one who's deemed essential.
I think that's a walk-off, folks. 83% of the workforce is furloughed. Only mission-critical parts like ISS operations remain fully active.
And the longer this goes on, boy, you start feeling it. Like I said, I'm a big believer that there are many jobs that need to either be done differently or don't need all the people they have. But man, I'm thinking about HHS and CDC particularly. Man, you have the wrong thing happen. Spinning things back up is hard. It's just hard.
Yeah, and it's not that these people are overhead or excessive. It's that many of them were working on long-range projects. And so you say, who do I need to be essential to run operations today versus all your people working on long-range programs and things just get pushed further and further down the road.
And the other thing that I think we don't talk enough about, this administration has proven that it is particularly not good at this, is just the administration of the government and the government workforce by and of itself. It is really hard once you've done these kind of shutdowns to communicate with all the humans that you may need at some point. Because usually what happens is you may trade staff out during times things become more important than not. I will tell you that just having effective communications to know who you have that does what and how you get a hold of them when you've sent them all home, and knowing that this administration is both new in its tenure and not particularly good at this. So you have that kind of additive effect as well. America, really listen to what Aunt Sue says. The federal government does provide a lot of the quiet that lets you live your life in the way you have grown to expect over many years.
Speaking of the administration, last week at Marine Corps Base Quantico, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and President Trump addressed an extraordinary gathering of generals and senior officers, commanders from around the world. Secretary Hegseth laid out a blunt new vision for the military. He denounced, quote, woke culture, decried fat generals and admirals, and called for sweeping fitness, grooming, no beardos, and merit-based standards. His message was loud and clear. If the new standard makes your heart sink, you should resign. No one missed the message, but it missed the moment. It offered tactics to leaders who set strategy or, at a minimum, execute the operational art of war. Was this the message these leaders needed to hear, Sue, about the future of the War Department?
I have really strong feelings about this just from a leadership perspective and as a leader who has taken over responsibility for a very expert cadre that knows much more about their discipline than I. So I have thoughts. But given, Eric, that you served in the military, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think it was a tactical speech. It didn't talk about the moment we're in, really, in terms of adversaries, how we're changing the acquisition process, how we're going to man, train, and equip the armed forces. But it talked about holding the standard, which, granted, they are responsible, we've talked about before, for everything that does or doesn't happen in their command. However, talking about how we're going to conduct training at boot camp, these are all tactical level things. And I think it also missed the mark on explaining administrative versus combat standards. And they're not standards so much as they're scaling on performance of fitness tests. There's still a minimum that's gender neutral to get into those jobs. The biggest issue I took was the contradictions, because maintaining a gender neutral standard, absolutely, there should be a standard for folks joining these, especially combat arms, but across the military, as there has been. That's not a change. But to say that everyone's going to now meet the male standard, like, no, it's just the standard. There are administrative differences in the scaling and the grading and the valuation of these fitness tests, but the standard to make it into these military operational specialties, MOSs, is gender neutral and has been since the integration.
Yeah, I think that's right. It was just the wrong speech, the wrong audience at the wrong time, even if some of the elements were fine. It felt much more like what you would expect to do to a room full of recruits, right? Or on a college campus, why you want to join and who you're going to be and what the ethos is. Mostly, I don't know what it was intended to accomplish with this set of leaders. And this set of leaders does need to understand the vision and what the national security strategy is going to be. And there was just none of that. I also think there's a little of hyperbole of the fact that you never call your leadership together in person. You certainly don't do it on the day before a government shutdown. You certainly don't do it with all those people at the same time. But leaders before, SecDefs before, chairmen before have met face-to-face with their leaders. So little hyperbole there. You kind of mentioned it. There are lots of different roles in the military. I think that the statement that diversity is our strength is somehow misguided or the source of all our problems. And that has been what led to the demise that you're assuming that we have been under, which again, I'm not sure. I see that we have a bereft military, so it's almost a manufactured problem from my view. But every leader knows that diversity is super important to mission accomplishment. Different in perspective, in history, in thought processes, in how you solve problems, in how you see problems, makes organizations stronger. And to suggest that you're going to take one view of what a warrior is, and you're going to say that is the view, and anything else is less meritorious and leads to less quality and less quality of outcome, is, I think, myopic, or at best myopic, and at worst suggesting that anything other than the best male standard, to use his words, is not wanted and not good. And I think it's one, wrong, two, dangerous, and three, we'll talk about the messages that he sent to women in that meeting. But jump into this notion of diversity as strength versus kind of the notion of individualism.
He mentioned that unity is a strength, not diversity. And I don't think those have to be exclusive, right? I think to join the military, you have to give up a good bit of individuality because you need to be reset and the baseline for your branch of service. There's cultural indoctrination. I mean, the Marine Corps is certainly a cult. And I think you sacrifice some of that, but where you come from and the diversity that you bring to the unit is critical to success. The way you approach problems, the way you look at things, the different perspectives you have. And some of the irony here is that I think they're not realizing that this is the bad policy because they've surrounded themselves with so many people that don't have diversity of opinion or diversity of experience. And it's a lot of seemingly yes men who are not pushing back on that, because if you don't agree and you don't fall in line, you're fired.
Yeah. Unity and diversity shouldn't be set at odds. Difference is good, but you do have to be aligned against the mission of the organization. It isn't you pursuing your fight. It is, here's what we need in order to pursue ours. Totally agree with that. The version within the intelligence community is, yes, you're going to have to give up your personal electronics in your workspace in order to work in intelligence. Right. I know that hurts your social presence, but we just can't have that, right? So you always, to be part of something, you have to adhere to what that mission requires. But this is a very different argument than that. This comes across as, and if you bundle it with other activity, comes across with there's one thing that's right as a leader, and I know as a leader that's not true. Plus, and you've said this to me before, our fighting forces have to represent America. They have throughout our history. Those 2 world wars that he cited as the last time we won, who was fighting side by side in those wars? I just think it's wrong-headed, and I think it is intended to send a message of we only want a certain kind of people. And I'll go off for a second on what feels like an assault on women, just a bit in terms of this administration writ large and in the military, is to suggest that not meeting an administrative standard has anything to do with merit, or that the only standard is a physical standard in order to ensure merit, and that standard is male, says we don't want you, to women. And I think it's happening societally. I think we see history being removed under the guise of we're not DEI. I think this really needs to be, and this is now speaking Sue Gordon, and you don't have to align yourself with this, but when you dismiss Lisa Franchetti, who was a CNO with an unbelievable record of military accomplishment in the fleet, it's hard to take away anything other than we don't want women. And I think this is a problem.
Yeah, I don't know if that's certainly, that's how you received it, right? And so at the very least, that message is having a deleterious effect.
The CIA in 1980 was a very male organization. I've been there. I've felt it. Here are a couple things that I know to be true. Number one, people will tolerate being treated indecently in order to pursue the mission they love. Your job as a leader is to never make them make that choice. There are women in all these disciplines that are made to feel less, but they don't say anything because they want so badly to serve. So as a leader, you just can't put people to that choice, and you can't treat them badly. The second thing is there are real, I don't know if you're going to have to bleep me for this, Eric. There are real shitheads who do really horrible things, whether for racist or for sexist reasons. And the system has gotten really pretty good at identifying those people and getting rid of it. Now, I'm not sure I'm down for what Secretary Hegseth said about we're going to get rid of serial complainers in the military. I would prefer he said we're going to get rid of serial offenders, but I'll let that go as him misspeaking. But the system pretty much knows what to do with the real bums in today's society. Even the military does, although if we stop listening to people saying things are happening to them, I wonder how long that will stay. But as a woman, so again, this is just me, who's spent a career in a male-dominated environment, I think the hardest thing to put up with is, yeah, I'll make my choice about what I'll put up with personally in order to do the mission I love, and I'll trust that the organization gets rid of the real bums. I think the hard thing for being a woman is actually the good guys that are around us. So everything good that I've done in my career has been with an amazing either leader who led me, a partner who worked with me, subordinate who delivered for me, disproportionately. Guys, I love working with men. I love who they are. I've spent a career with it. But the one thing that would, I think, be wonderful if the good guys in women's lives would quit questioning whether it's hard for us. I don't need any of them to fix it for me, but to accept that every woman any of you who's listening works with puts up with 1,000 small cuts a day to do nothing more than pursue the exact same mission you're pursuing. You don't have to fix it. Just don't say, oh, come on. They didn't mean that. You didn't hear that right. I'm just saying. This is a real moment. And if you look at what's happening to women in the workforce, if you look at the policies of this administration, if you look at straight numbers, and you contrast that with the fact that more than half our population is female in the United States, that more than half of college graduates that we need are female, more than half of the talent we know, can we really afford to be doing anything that makes them not want to come and pursue this mission? I just think it's wrongheaded.
These people are making enough of a sacrifice, right, by joining the service, and they shouldn't have to make those additional sacrifices to belong, right?
Yeah, don't we want everyone with talent and ability to be part of this mission? And don't we want anyone to be able to succeed? Even if you're not a social warrior, just from an outcome perspective, use your talent. It's there. All right. But that was not the only item on the menu
That wasn't the best part?
for those flag and general officers. The president also spoke to that same group. How'd you read that?
His campaign rally,
No, oops, I'm sorry. Did I say that out loud?
also missing the mark. I think when he went to the teleprompter and he had the speech, I think that probably would have been fine and it probably would have lasted 5 minutes. But man, the different references to the enemy within, that was tough.
One, just as a citizen, it's the president of the United States. If you're going to have that group of individuals in that room, this is a great opportunity for the president of the United States to address them. President Trump is who he is, and he does these things. I think this enemy within and setting up half of America as being not someone who would have different views of how best to serve America, but actually enemies. And then either explicitly or tacitly telling the U.S. military that they are going to be involved in a war against U.S. citizens, I think is deeply disturbing. And at a time when the world is filled with enough adversaries and competitors and threats to need our military to be well aligned with our strategy, to introduce that, one, I object to it as a U.S. citizen, but I think to introduce it to the military, what do you think those guys walked out of there thinking?
Probably a combination of things. I think some of them are concerned. I think some of them are taking it as a one-off or dismissing it as hyperbole. There were many ludicrous things that were said too, bringing back battleships. I mean, as much as I love the Mighty Mo and the 16-inch guns, that's not the war of the future. But I think the reason a lot of them didn't get up and walk out or protest was, one, they believe that they have a responsibility to their troops, back their units, their soldiers, sailors, airmen, marine, and guardians, that they have a responsibility to them and that they can affect their lives and make their lives better and protect them by continuing to be a leader. And second, getting up and walking out of there would have sounded a lot like a military coup. So I think they just sat there and took it in.
And hoping that campaign speech is not the same as an order. I think your point on their feeling of responsibility, because I think there were moments when I was like, oh, come on, just stand up and walk out. No way. They could not. Even as an intelligence officer that doesn't have nearly that same tactile responsibility, I did feel a responsibility to my women and men in the intelligence community. And deciding that you're just going to make a personal stand over a speech is just something that someone who swore to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States and feels a responsibility to their women and men cannot casually do. And there are a lot of people on TV that say, why aren't these people speaking up? Why aren't they saying things? And it is this profound sense of duty that I think is what you've so eloquently described, and why they listened. They recognized the difference between that and an order, and they're hoping that some things won't manifest or clarity will ensue to make it easier to make decisions. So in a way, the not walking out is evidence of the character of the women and men who serve.
Yep, absolutely.
I happened to catch some of his Navy's birthday speech down in Norfolk, and there are things that are said that I think we've gotten used to. The problem is there are new generations of leaders that come in every day who don't necessarily distinguish between something that's said and something they must do. And so thank goodness for the admirals and generals who are still setting a standard. And I worry whether this trend continues, because I think it's harder as you keep riffling through generations that are relatively newer and are getting new messaging.
I think you once told me that the term good enough for government work used to be a positive saying, like in the 30s and the New Deal era, that if it was good enough for government work, then that means it was like high praise and it was getting funded. Do you think the term presidential will change over time? Because I think the term presidential used to mean dignified and professional and well esteemed, but is that going to slip?
I think it already has. I think a lot of things are slipping at an alarming rate. What I hope doesn't happen, and again, to harken back to some of our messaging in other episodes, Eric, despite all these comments, don't you hope that the nation's best continues to come and serve? Whether they're in government agencies serving the nation that way, the intelligence community serving the nation that way, or in the military. So one of the biggest worries that I have is that there isn't that equanimity and kind of presidential level of talking and appropriate messaging that, much like my comment about women, some of our best and brightest will say, nah, I don't want to serve. And we have so benefited from the quality of Americans across the country from all walks of life have made the choice to serve. So that's probably one of the biggest worries I have, is that you're going to get a non-diverse, politically aligned narrowing of the applicant pool because of these changes in just national political dynamic and less attention to all the citizens than we seem to be having coming out of the president today. So that's my worry. There are a lot of other things that we'll have to solve along the way. But boy, if America and America's best doesn't want to serve, that's going to be problematic for us to achieve the things we need to.
So, what are you watching next week?
So I'm watching the budget and what happens with this government shutdown. If we were still making predictions, which we walked away from because we were wrong so often.
You think it'll last?
No, I think that the GOP has a lot to lose if they keep the shutdown and a lot to gain if they will take on the issue, narrow issue of health care that they know Americans are all behind. And if they don't take care of it, it'll blow up the economy even worse. So I'm going to watch it, and I think the GOP is going to have to be the one that does some capitulating, although I'm not sure I see President Trump as being willing to do what President Netanyahu does. So I'm watching that. There's some new developments on last week's story on the SIM farm that we might talk about in the future. They found even more SIM cards and servers, and early assessment of who did it is China. So I think I want to talk more about that as an infrastructure attack. And then this is a paid political announcement. I am watching for what new, Sue's word, insane social media post comes out of the White House at some crazy hour that is suggesting something like flag burning is illegal, you must arrest people immediately, and sentence them to no less than 1 year. Just for the people that are listening to us, there's a big difference between a social media post, even if made by the president, and an action that's really going to happen. In this case, it's constitutional to burn the flag, whether we agree with that or not. The president does not make statute. So just what I want people to know is take a little bit of a steady strain on social media, even from government officials, because there is a difference between that and what can actually happen within the rule of law. How about you?
Yeah, so one of the things I'm watching may generate some insane social media posting. 2025 Nobel Peace Prize comes out on Friday.
What, do you have a prediction on that?
I do not think President Trump is going to win. I'm interested to see if the United States develops their own peace prize in response to this.
Apparently, we're developing our own Trump coin.
That's right. Lots of presidents have coins, though. I just don't think it needs two pictures of him. Like, have his face on one side and then have some cool building on another.
No, now again, I don't think it's statute. It's probably policy. You don't put living people's names on government buildings, nor do they have their own coins. You generally let time happen a little bit to decide who you want on there. But I'll take your two-picture point.
I'm also watching October 9th, Comey's arraignment, see what happens there. And then last week, Ukraine got clearance for some long-range intel and fusion, some target development. So the U.S. approved targeting intelligence to help Ukraine with long-range strikes on Russian energy infrastructure deep inside Russia. So not providing any long-range missiles at this point, but trying to go after the energy and power since we're not doing secondary sanctions on oil.
Yeah, so the targeting is an interesting enabler. It's a nice intermediate step. Because again, I think something has to give where stasis isn't going to be good for Ukraine, and so helping them push it over the edge maybe. Russia's doing some pretty good saber rattling on warning the U.S. not to provide long-range cruise missiles. I like this topic as something to watch in the near term.
All right. Well, that's what we're watching. Thank you for joining us, and no doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
Echoing Eric, thanks for joining us. Remember, we're here for you. Look for the link in the show notes to provide feedback or suggest topics for next time. We're easy but not cheap. Join us next week, please, for Understandable Insights podcast, wherever you listen. And as always, go forth, do good, and be kind to one another.